good afternoon, and welcome everyone. Today, you'll be hearing about an exciting project that we've been working on with our friends in Cincinnati, Ohio. And in this presentation, you're going to learn about how Cincinnati has successfully kicked off a gold standard tree canopy project using LiDAR data at its core, and how they're using this data they've collected to answer some very important questions within their community. So just to go through this real quickly, we've got a lot to cover today, and we're going to be getting started right after some quick introductions. And in short, you're going to be hearing from some of the preeminent experts on LiDAR and tree canopy capture technology in the country, and then directly from our clients, partners, and friends about how this project got started and what they've learned along the way. And we're hoping this gives you all the tools and information that you need to get your own effort started in your own city, or perhaps advanced what you've already started. Your residents are counting on you to do it. And, before we dive in here, I couldn't help but share this quote. It's kind of stuck with me ever since I first heard it. And that is, "A society grows great when its leaders plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in." So let that resonate with you for a moment. But this is all about investing in the future of our communities. And with advancements in technology, we now have the ability to not only plant trees, but understand the trees that we have better than any other time in human history. And this is what you'll be hearing about today. And these are the people you'll be hearing about it from. So welcome to our team of presenters, led by Brian Coolidge, a senior project manager here at AppGeo. He is the project manager for this particular project and has a lot of insight into managing projects of all sizes and all shapes. But we've been so excited for this project in particular that we felt we had to bring it to you in the form of a webinar. And that's where I come in, Aaron Doucette, here with AppGeo. I am the leader of our webinar program and have bring you lots of interesting stories on many topics, this being one of my favorites so far to put together. So been a real pleasure to be a part of the team. But more importantly, our esteemed experts for today, you are joined by Jarlath O'Neil-Dunne. He is the director of the Spatial Analysis Lab at UVM. And when you say tree canopy, this is the guy that I want you to be thinking of, because he's not only an expert in his field, world-renowned, but really a great guy to work with. And we're so happy to have him on this team and on this presentation. Also, Mike Galvin, he's a consulting arborist with the SavATree company, and he's here to offer us some very expert arborist perspectives on the topics we're talking about here today. Trees on the ground, they're living and breathing things just like us, and you need an expert who can understand that when approaching one of these large scale projects. And then perhaps our favorite guests are our clients from the city of Cincinnati. We're joined today by Matt Dibona. He is a GIS Systems Analyst within the city. And also Crystal Courtney, she is the division manager of natural resources. So I hope you all brought your Skyline chili, because we're going to be digging in today with our friends at Cincinnati. Now, I want to again welcome everyone, and we're going to start with Jarlath to introduce us in a little bit more detail about, we're looking at these tree canopy projects. What does that really mean from a technological perspective? What is some of the data that we're looking at today? How does it get into our hands? And why is this something a city should be really thinking about? This man has been helping cities coast to coast, probably too many to count at this point. So Jarlath, let's just kind of kick things off and talk about what has your background been in this area and why cities should be thinking about tree canopy.
Yeah, Aaron, and I think most of the people on this call are really aware that our green infrastructure is going to be crucial to our survival. We used to think of this in the coming decades, and I think with the environmental challenges we've seen this past year, it's really the coming years, and that may be dealing with the urban heat island, improving equity, reducing the effects of air pollution, dealing with stormwater runoff, providing wildlife habitat. And then ultimately, as communities and cities are investing in their tree canopy, you want to be able to quantify that investment. And that's why accuracy is really important. And so if we go to some of the next slides here, I'd like to take a little bit about what is quality tree canopy change mapping, right? Because a lot of people are saying that they're mapping tree canopy, and you've probably heard some of these things out there. And I think there's really three things we want to keep in mind. One, we want to make sure that it's really precise. Two, we want to make sure that we quantify loss and gain. That's very, very important. And then 3, it has to be accurate. And sometimes we'll hear people say all these buzzwords out there, right? Like artificial intelligence and all these great button pushing technologies we have. And maybe it's 95 or 97% accurate. In the case of most cities, tree canopy change is on the order of 1, 2, or maybe 3%. So maybe you're 95 and 97% accurate, and that sounds impressive, but you're still within the margin of error. And so where we see the technology going and the effort is that we need to make sure that we're providing you, the folks that invested in your tree canopy, with accurate information, because small errors can result in a huge change in thinking you've lost tree canopy when you may have gained, or maybe you've gained when you've lost. And we'll dive into some more of that. And you can see here just the challenges in using imagery alone. So this is examples from Cincinnati. We're so fortunate to have imagery because if we look at this first image from time period 1 from 2011, and then if we go to time period 2, you can certainly see some changes there, but it's not readily clear what those changes are. In some cases, the shadows have shifted. In other cases, actually features have been removed. And if we go to the next slide and we just look at vegetation change, some of the change that gets picked up in these automated approaches is actually vegetation change, right? It's that construction, it's that removal. But in a lot of other cases, it can be simple things like the trees leaning in different directions due to the way the imagery was acquired, or maybe it's shadows present. So imagery alone is rarely suitable to accurately quantify both your gains and losses in tree canopy. And it's really important to capture both of those, because if you're just mapping your loss, which is what a lot of approaches do, you're really not capturing all the investment that you've made in your tree canopy.
Hey, Jarlath, I think I'm back. Sorry, can you guys all hear me now?
Yeah, we've got you, Brian.
All right, sorry, I had a Zoom crash there. But anyway, yeah, thanks for joining us, Jarlath, today. So, you've used LiDAR for several of our larger projects, including New York City and currently in Cincinnati. Our partner on that project, Quantum Spatial, who's now NV5 Geospatial, has produced some really great QL1 data for these projects in support of them. Could you give us, a good explanation of, explain to everybody what is LiDAR and how it really can provide really good, accurate results, as well as how you can couple that with other data sets to really give you some really good data to use?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. It's a great question. So imagery is wonderful. We just took a look at some great images, leaf on from the National Agriculture Imagery Program. The problem, like we discussed, is that the trees lean. LiDAR is much more accurate. It gives us a precise location of the tree canopy. When we talk about something like QL1, that means it's the USGS, sort of essentially their highest standard for LiDAR. And it enables us to do very, very detailed mapping. And LiDAR technology, in which a laser sensor is used, can provide the most detailed mapping of things in 3D and do things that really over a decade ago we didn't think is possible. So we can take a look at sort of some of the beautiful LiDAR products in this next slide here that we have in Cincinnati, right? I mean, really amazing looking at the stadium there. And not only can we capture the built infrastructure, but just look what we see in the trees. And LiDAR technology enables us to see through the shadows because it's producing its own energy, and also enables us to capture the height of trees, which is really important when we want to look at losses. We can tell communities not only perhaps you're losing or gaining tree canopy, but particularly with the losses, where are those losses happening across your height classes? Are your trees able to achieve something close to maturity before they're removed?
That's great. Thanks, Jarlath. So Matt, let's turn to you for a second here. And you were really an integral part of getting this whole project going on this city of Cincinnati side. Can you maybe give us a quick background of what your goals were for this project?
Yeah, I can do that for you, Brian. So our goals kind of date back to actually 2000. So the city had been doing UTCs since 2000, 2010. And we were looking at doing another UTC for 2020. And how we went about that is we got a grant from the U.S. Forestry Service and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to split the cost in half for us to acquire the UTC. And then we put it out to bid and went through a very intense process and trying to figure out what organization would provide us with the best detailed proposal in acquiring this information. And here we are now.
So that's great. So, one of the things that we did run into, COVID, this was all kind of getting ready for release right about the time of COVID. How did that impact getting this project going?
So, I mean, as we all know, COVID a break on pretty much everybody's plans. So that kind of bumped things back a little bit for us. We were planning on actually acquiring the LiDAR, the raw LiDAR, spring going into summer of this year, or last year, excuse me, of 2020. However, everything got pushed out until September. And we were a little reluctant to take a photo that late with leaf drop. However, as we found out, it actually provided us way better information. And you can kind of probably go into further detail with that, Brian, on what it really provided for us. And what it really showed us in the end is we didn't just take a picture of the top of the canopy. We actually got to take a picture of the entire canopy and going underneath into the understory, which really provided us really, really good, relevant information. Not just the tree tops, but the actual trees themselves.
So that's a really good point there, Matt. We started collecting in September. We ran into some weather issues where we got rain kind of pushed us off for a couple of weeks, and we're real fortunate that NV5 was able to kind of continue to mobilize and support this as we tried to make a decision on whether we should keep going or not, or just hold off to the spring. And I think we were all antsy to get it done, but we wanted to make sure we actually captured really good data. So we kind of huddled, and Jarlath, we spoke with you, and what were your thoughts originally? Crystal gave us a good update on where the canopy was, how much they had lost so far, and they were down to, I think, 95% that they were still had on the trees at the time. And as we were looking at the weather, what were some of your thoughts? When do we stop collecting, and when do we just hold off to the spring?
Yeah, that was one of the challenges for this project. And in LiDAR acquisition, there's always a bit of tension between the sort of people who want the detailed information on the ground, sort of public works, and then us tree people who really want a great representation of the canopy. And we're really fortunate in this case that Quantum did an excellent job with data acquisition that I think really threaded sort of the needle really well, where there was enough leaf out that we obtained an excellent representation of the tree canopy. And at the same time, the point density for the ground was also outstanding, enabling these LiDAR data to be used far beyond tree canopy assessment and for numerous things like public works and hydrologic modeling.
Well, that's great. So Crystal, you've been a real important part of this project as well as Matt, getting it going and making it happen. So, one of the things was really at the beginning of this was getting some stakeholders together and getting the proper funding to make sure that you could do it and do it right. Could you give us maybe a little background on the importance of those stakeholders, who they were, and where that funding is coming from?
Absolutely. Yeah, my predecessor, Dave Gamstetter, actually applied for this grant. In 2018 was the first time, and then we didn't get it the first time around. So then we applied again in 2019, just with the same exact, grant application. But with the addition of a local organization that would actually be planting out and implementing the UTC. So once we actually were awarded the grant, it had been almost 2 years since the original kind of stakeholder collaboration had taken place. So Matt and I were both new at that time. We both started at the beginning of 2019. This grant came in August. And what we found was that a lot of the stakeholders that had been a part of the original grant application were no longer involved at all. So we basically had to start from the ground up. So with that, we went to our local planning department, the Hamilton County Planning Department, and found that they were not in any way, shape, or form able to be a part of the stakeholder group. They were expected to put forward 50% of the countywide cost, and come to find out it hadn't been budgeted in. So it kind of put us into a scramble to really identify where our best partners would be in the city to actually make this project happen. And with that, we ended up reaching out to the Metropolitan Sewer District of Hamilton County, MSD, and they were actually able to see the benefit of doing this tree canopy analysis once we explained the different kind of data deliverables that we would be getting. That it's not only canopy, it's also land cover classification. And for them, what they were most interested in was the impervious surface mapping, as they're looking to do some sort of tax or fee for impervious surface on private property. So it was phenomenal to be able to be at the table with MSD to discuss how canopy can be implemented into this new fee program. And to the point that they were willing to fund half of this project altogether. And And so that's been out of this project, we would have not had as close ties with the stormwater management entity as we do now. And we're actually collaborating on several more projects moving forward now that we've built this partnership. Outside of that, this is a countywide UTC. So we look to our other planning entities. We have the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Regional Planning Organization, as well as our county parks. And so those were kind of our core stakeholders outside of the implementation team, which ended up being Groundwork Ohio River Valley, who will be actually planting out based on the prioritization.
Well, thanks, Crystal. So Matt, you've got a lot of background in urban forestry, but as well as GIS. Can you maybe talk a little bit to the point of how are you using GIS to support what you're doing there?
We're using GIS from the top down and bottom up. Locally, we've started to do tree inventory in-house. We're also identifying all of our assets spatially within the park system. And then on top of that, now with our UTC, we're going to be looking from the bottom down. We're going to show you a couple examples of what we're really going to do with that. And it's allowed us to not only look at things at a localized level, but definitely that regional level. Again, like MSD as our partner, they're really concerned about these localized tree incidences. They want to look at watersheds, right? But if we take a photo that has such great resolution, we get both. So that's where we're in the midst of creating everything, where a lot of things are coming in, and hopefully in the next year, we're going to shoot a lot of stuff back out. This information is really great for us, but we also want to share this information with the county, or if not anyone in the state, or if not, the country. The work we're doing here, we want to be able to leverage that for any planner, any MSD, anywhere, to really get this information across. So yeah, a lot of cool things are coming with our GIS, and this is just kind of icing on the cake of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it.
Yeah, that's great. So, Mike, let's ask you a quick question here. And your background, you're an arborist by trade. You run the consulting group there at SavATree. How do you see GIS being supportive of all these processes?
As a natural resources manager, you want the information you have to manage the canopy that you have before you, and there's no way you could, on the ground, collect these data in any efficient manner. I've been fortunate to work with Jarlath on these types of projects for close to a couple of decades now, and it's really the only process that I'm aware of where you as a natural resources manager can get your arms around the extent and location of your canopy to make plans to manage those resources accurately. It's really a unique tool.
So, as part of this project, we really, we have the data collection, we have a lot of data development, as well as analysis. So we're going to talk about the analysis in a little bit, but Jarlath, let's talk a little bit about the data development part of this process. Beyond the tree canopy, developing an accurate land cover data set is super important to this process. It's not just tree canopy alone. So, could you walk us why it's important for us to goes into developing one of these high quality data sets?
Yeah, Brian, absolutely. And I think one of the great things about this project is we weren't just mapping the trees. We had a unique opportunity to bundle a whole host of land cover mapping products that really fit the needs of a broad range of stakeholders throughout the city and the county. And it all comes down to quality, right? If we're not mapping to a very, very, very high standard, we're not giving people the type of actionable information that they can use to comfortably make decisions. And that can be around how much their tree canopy changed to how much impervious surfaces they have and of what type. So we go to the next slide. We'll walk through some of the data that we had here. And it's important to note that no data set is sort of ever perfect for these tree canopy assessments, right? We don't have $1 million we can just go out there and spend, but we did have really good point cloud data, partially leaf on. And a lot of our studies, we work with leaf off point cloud data, and that's certainly workable as well. But in this case, really high quality LiDAR data acquired by our partners at NV5. And if we go to the next slide, we apply some really nice algorithms that allows us to extract those tree canopy points from the LiDAR data. Now, of course, tree canopy points don't tell you anything. It's a nice little derivative product and it looks pretty cool, but it's just 3D points that represent trees, right? We need to still process this more to get it into useful information. And to that, we bring together the imagery, the LiDAR all together. So let's go back to that area we looked at before with some changes happening there. There's the imagery we had from 2011, freely available NAPE data, leaf on, really nice to show the tree canopy. Go to the next slide here. We'll take a look at the data that we had from 2020. Slightly different resolution. You can see the shadows are in different locations. So the challenging thing here is that edge of that tree canopy is not in the same location in those two images. However, we also had LiDAR, fortunately, from two time periods. We take a look at the next slide here, LiDAR from 2011, completely leaf off, not as high quality as the LiDAR that we have for 2020, and we'll see that in the next slide there with that height above ground or normalized digital surface model. So our goal and our challenge was to bring all of these amazing data sets there that were available and do this very, very detailed, accurate, and precise mapping so we can give Crystal and Matt the information they need. And we're happy to report that we had a lot of success doing that. And we take a look at the next slide here with our tree canopy change mapping. What you see here is that we're actually mapping the change, right? We're not just giving you a number. We're not mapping separately from two time periods. At a very, very, very precise scale, we're going in and mapping the gain, loss, and the no change. And this is incredibly important because we hear so much stuff nowadays about how cities are losing tree canopy. And I'm convinced that in many of these cases, it's because people are not taking the time and effort to quantify the gain. And that's really difficult to do unless you're integrating the LiDAR and imagery together. And it's this precise accounting of the gain, loss, and no change that gives you the greatest insights into what's happening into your city. And in the case of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, we're seeing that, sure, there are definitely some stark losses in some places. And then we also see the benefits of tree plantings that perhaps happened over a decade ago, and those trees that are now contributing canopy. And we also see the benefits of leaving areas alone so that natural succession and growth can take place. And if you can maintain those trees and just leave them alone, those large trees, even if they only contribute a little bit more of new canopy, are going to provide you a substantial increase in tree canopy over time. If we take a look at the next slide here, we also coupled this with bottom-up impervious mapping. So the tree canopy is top-down, and with the impervious surfaces, there was some existing impervious surface map, and we coupled that with an update that used semi-automated techniques. So we're able to do this in a manner that's much, much more cost-effective than things that were done before. And if we take the next slide here, we're also, as Matt, the land cover data. Yep, so we brought it all together, your green, your brown, your blue and your gray infrastructure, right? So bringing those impervious surfaces and the tree canopy, so top-down land cover, so you have everything all together. And then if we take a look at the next slide, well, the neat things that we added to this project that was not in the original scope, but turns out the LiDAR supported it, and we did some new algorithm development, was tree count. So these green circles here represent the crown of the tree, and those little purple dots there represent the tree centroids. And I think to really appreciate this, we have to go to the next slide and sort of zoom in a bit. And this is a really, really nice data set here, because what we're able to do is for each one of these trees here, we can provide information such as the height and crown radius and crown diameter. And then we can turn this over to Matt, who's had so much success in using it. And I think this was just one of the highlights of this project, right? It wasn't something that was in the original scope, but it turned out we've got really good LiDAR data. We're able to improve in some of our algorithms. And this is one of those things, I think, Matt, I recall sort of we generated it on Friday night and turned it over to you and said, hey, do you think this is useful? And it ended up being really useful to you folks, which was just wonderful. And then with that information, we can begin to get at some of these other metrics. The existing tree canopy, that's what you have, and the possible tree canopy, which is the land available, right? And we're in the process right now, if we go to the next slide, of just showing you some of these initial statistics, right? If we go ahead and look at neighborhood, right? Which neighborhoods have the highest amounts of tree canopy? And if we take a look at the next slide, where do folks have the room to plant trees? We've got a lot of detailed information here, and we'll be summarizing this by land use, by census block groups, computing ecosystem services in the coming months, so that we can do these detailed assessments by neighborhoods or all the way down to the property parcel. Or if we look at the next slides, right, just those general summaries, which is what does Hamilton County have? Or if we look at the next slide, what does the city have for its percentage of tree canopy? We know that all of these metrics are useful to people because we think of things at different geographical scales.
Some really good information there, Jarlath. So one of the questions I think people might have, or we've certainly run into in a lot of different projects we've worked on with you, is comparing a data set that we're building today with an older data set. In Cincinnati, they had some older data, didn't have the same characteristics that we had, going forward. How do you work with those different types of data set to really get a good tree canopy change data set?
Yeah, it's really important, Brian, because we've gone in to sort of and take a second look at some projects that have been done out there, and quite often people are taking a really simplistic approach, and we put in a lot of time both using automated algorithms and then manual quality assurance, quality control, to do our absolute best to differentiate between data changes, right? So maybe the trees is leaning in different directions, or in one point in time it was leaf off and then leaf on LiDAR, to actually computing the change that was due to features on the ground. And I saw a question pop in there about, what if you have 2 leaf off LiDAR data sets? Is that still workable? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, the data we have for urban forestry analysis is never ideal, but it's getting better all the time. So if all you have is leaf off data, the good news is the leaf off data sets now are getting better and better for LiDAR data, and we're able to couple those with the leaf on imagery and really do this detailed, accurate accounting that shows, like we see here, the tree canopy gain. And that's not something we were doing 5 years ago. And it's really wonderful to be able to see this, because we know you folks are putting a lot of effort into planting your trees and caring for your tree canopy in your communities. And it's a real shame in the past that all the mapping has just focused on loss and really hasn't calculated this gain that is happening. And I think it's sort of skewed our analysis and skewed our thinking as to sort of what's happening in our urban areas.
That's a good point, Jarlath. One of the original requests was to get some more ortho photography, and you might have mentioned this when at the beginning, but we opted not to get the ortho photography updated, leaf on, and we decided to use the NAPE. You've been really successful using NAPE imagery, which of course is free to people, right? So is there anything people should know about, issues with that? Is that a good route to go? Do you recommend people get the ortho photography if they have to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so NAPE is a great product out there, right? It's freely available. And if we just have 2 sets of imagery data sets from NAPE, right, which is leaf on, like you see here, time period 1 and time period 2, we can still do tree canopy change. It's just going to be biased towards loss, because that's what we can do accurately. The trees, due to some of the parallax in the imagery, are leaning in different directions. We can't do the precise accounting of gain. Where the LiDAR helps us out is we can do the precise accounting of gain. And that can oftentimes mean a big difference in terms of whether your city or your community shows a loss in tree canopy, or maybe it's breaking even, or perhaps in some cases, we've actually seen gains in tree canopy, or we've seen gains in certain areas where we know the community's invested in tree canopy, and it was only LiDAR that allowed us to pick up those trees, whether it was the new growth around the existing tree canopy, or in major cities, all those trees that are hidden in the shadows of buildings.
So now that we've got the data developed, we're talking about doing some analysis here. Let's maybe talk a little bit about how this can be more useful to us and what some of these other benefits for. So I'm going to turn to you for a second, Mike, and let's talk about a little bit about risk management. Trees are great. They provide a lot of great benefits to the city, but they also provide some risk. How can we take advantage of these data sets, to help reduce that risk in the urban environment?
Great opportunity to operationalize these data. So the industry standard for tree risk assessment says probability times consequences equals risk. Probability is the probability of the tree failing and impacting a target, but the consequences relate to the target. So one of the great things about these data is the quality is so high, you've got in the data set the height of the tree, and you can buffer that tree point by the tree height, and that's the target zone. That's the things that might get impacted if the tree fails. So really useful to be able to put that on the ground and put those, when you've got limited resources for inspection, to say we want to focus on certain types of targets that fall within target zones and assess those trees rather than having to assess the entire population of trees. Again, a great tool for being efficient at a city scale.
I think you make a really good point there, Mike. Utilizing GIS when you may not have the resources to be able to do something, but you still can use your data set to get some really meaningful information. So I think those are some really good points. Crystal, we've got all this data waiting to be used. What are some of your long-term goals with using these different data sets?
So first and foremost, just to piggyback off of what Mike was just presenting, was really using this data to set prioritization for risk management. We manage 5,000 acres of parkland. We have a risk management plan that spells out exactly what our frequency of inspection will be. And for our park boundaries, it's at least once every 6 years. But by having the tree points in relation with the polygonized risk management zones, we were able to accurately identify exactly how and where we should start based on the likelihood of the tree failing in hitting a building or a playset or something that's on private property adjacent to park board property. So that first and foremost really allowed us to really kind of set our goals based on where we wanted to go for this with this tree risk assessment. Yeah, and here's a great image of that overlay. So you have the tree points, and then you have, risk management zone 1, 2, and 3 based on, red to green. And so beyond this, it also gave us the ability to say roughly how many trees do we have in parks that we need to be assessing each year. And so we're able to use that information in order to justify our budget and staffing needs for parks in order to do this work, in order to stay within the acceptable zone of liability that we take on as urban forestry managers. Aside from that, I think for me, I like I said, I started in 2019 and I came in and we had a data set that was from 2010. So it was really hard to go and communicate to communities based upon 2010 data. So we've kind of been holding off on really doing some detailed community engagement until we had this information. So first and foremost, UTC Roadshow. So going from the top down, bottom up, internally, just to ensure that we all have a common understanding, common language, and really a full review of the data set in order to really determine what our goals are. So trying to set goals prior to that was relatively difficult, just not knowing exactly where the canopy fell. So the idea is that we will go to all the stakeholders, be them council members and commissioners, to neighborhood groups, to not only communicate where's the city as a whole, where's your individual neighborhood, but also to build allies within each one of those areas so that we can really kind of partner for the long term to implement these goals. The majority of the plantable space is going to be on private property, kind of in most people's backyards. So if we're not getting this information out there, it's going to be really hard for us to convince somebody that, this is the right thing to do, that planting a tree is the right thing to do. Beyond that, the data allows us to really dive into the existing policies that we have in the city. We have a long-running program. We've been around since the 1980s, the Urban Forestry Program has. So we're really lucky in that regard. But what we've seen through these UTCs, the 3 iterations from 2000, is that where we're seeing the majority of canopy gain is going to be on public property, or where we really have control over canopy is going to be within the right-of-way. This information will allow us to show, where we're losing canopy is largely going to be on our private property as developments are coming in. And so by showing and quantifying the amount of canopy that we're losing, we can best, communicate to our leaders what policies might need to be in place in order to ensure that we maintain that 43% canopy for the long haul. And then finally, it's just implementation. So some of our core goals go back to the UTC goals that most cities have, mitigating heat island, all those different aspects. And so with that, our overall canopy coverage goals for Cincinnati follows the industry standards. So 40% citywide, 40% in residential areas. We have 10% for our downtown business districts, and then 25% for our mixed use areas. So really taking this data and developing those reforestation zones that we really want to target based upon where they fall within the zoning code. As far as canopy and equity goes, historically, we've not planted specifically for the disenfranchised communities. We've pretty much been trying to plant according to that industry standard. So we just want to make sure that anyone who's living in a residential neighborhood has 40% canopy. But what we're really looking to do with this data set is to take it a step further, to get into a more micro focus where we're looking at the zoning designations of our areas versus looking at a whole neighborhood where you can have industry and residential and business districts all in the same neighborhood. What we really want to look at is how does the canopy look where people actually live? So within those residential areas. So where we had a study done in Cincinnati in 2015 that looked at the equitable distribution of canopy based on the 2010 data. And what they found is that our canopy is equitably distributed. We're lucky in that regard. But looking a little deeper, what we see is that the majority of that canopy is on undevelopable hillsides. So it's not necessarily in your front yard. It's not necessarily on the streets that you live on. So are you actually getting those benefits that we know that trees provide to our community members? And so being able to take this data set a step further and really dig into, what does it look like where you live? And then communicating that directly to people so that it actually has a tie back to your home. I'd say beyond that, heat island is another big thing. Obviously, there was a 2019 study done by the University of Wisconsin, Madison, that found that if you continue to plant out from where you already have 40% canopy, then the heat island, the mitigation of heat island increases. So that's something that we really want to look at doing with this study as well. Beyond that, one of the major differences between this UTC and the past two iterations is that we specifically wanted to look at the impacts of PM 2.5. We had a devastating blowout here with the emerald ash borer. We lost a good portion of our canopy. We also are surrounded by interstates. We have I-75, 275. So the entire city is engulfed in interstates. So what we really wanted to look at is where are our communities being impacted by this particulate matter, and then plant according to that. So that's kind of how we're handling the pollution aspects of this. Just given that we are so surrounded by traffic. So those are some of our bigger goals. But again, I think a lot of our goals should be defined based upon, what the community members really want to see. And we can take this expertise to them, but really communicating what our goals are, defining what their goals are, and then coming together is where you really get a good project and a really solid canopy. When you can have your community members speak to the reasons why canopy is important, that's the ultimate win.
Well, the nice thing is, Crystal, too, I think with that 43%, I think in Jarlath, you could probably give us some more input, but they're much higher than a lot of other cities, correct, that you've seen?
Yeah, certainly the tree canopy is higher. And I think when we do these percentages, we always have the temptation to compare ourselves to others. And really, when it comes to tree canopy, I think we want to focus, are the trees in the right place, right, to achieve our objectives, stormwater runoff, air pollution, environmental equity. And we see in some cities that they may have a lot of tree canopy, but then we find pockets through our detailed analysis that are actually really lacking in tree canopy. And also through this change analysis, what's really nice is we're able to provide Matt and Courtney with the detailed information on where the gains and losses are happening so that they can better understand the drivers of these changes, because they're dealing with a lot of things: urbanization, landowners making separate decisions, invasive species, right? The founder's effect, in which tree canopy may age out over time, in addition with new plantings, and all of those things give that much more nuanced story that allows them to make very informed decisions rather than just saying, "Hey, let's slap ourselves on the back and move on like we've got good canopy."
So Matt, let's talk real quickly. One of the goals of this project was coming up with some impervious surface mapping. MSD had provided a bunch of funding for you to help really get a better understanding, mapping some parking lots that they didn't have. So one of the ideas was, can they implement fees based on the amount of impervious surfaces, a particular property has? Obviously, people don't like hearing about fees, but how can you use this data set to really, try to make this a more fair and equitable process?
No, it's a good question, Brian. Fortunately here in Cincinnati, they bit the GIS bullet very early. So we have a very robust GIS system here in Cincinnati. And the one thing we were lacking when it came to digitizing impervious surfaces were the outliers, parking lots, and kind of those weird impervious surface, may it be concrete around a pool, but we had buildings, sidewalks, roads, driveways, you name it. And one of the things we were presented, and this is why this partnership kind of blossomed with MSD, they are potentially looking at creating a wet water fee into the future. Can't really speak to where they're diving down, but the one thing they were curious about was, even if you map the impervious surface, if you have a tree on top of that impervious surface, that does make an impact on that impervious surface. So here we're kind of combining all of those data sets into one. So it's not just taking a picture of your impervious surface, it's really taking a picture of the whole land classification set and kind of setting that precedent. Instead of just going after impervious surface, what really does that environment look like? And MSD was very excited to kind of make that next step. They are a partner in us that, we have a descent decree in the city of Cincinnati. We have one of the worst combined sewer overflows in the country, which is a really big problem. And one of the things they do is they do compensate our parks department with the ability for us to continually create and maintain our green infrastructure. And where it all came from was our 2010 UTC and kind of putting a benefit to what this green infrastructure was doing for the entire community. So this is kind of one of our ways to update that data set and to get even more accurate information for us to allow MSD to really see those kind of breakthroughs in mitigating stormwater. But again, they're not just going after stormwater and their impervious feed. We're not just going after our tree canopy. We as a city are doing this together. And I think we're saving a lot of money in bringing that synergy together to have a really good product. This data is not expensive or not cheap. It's very expensive stuff. And we're trying to leverage that cost to try to push it around to as many departments as we can to get our best bang for our buck. And this is a really good example in that and what they'll do with this in the future. And they've only been thrilled with the data they keep getting when we go through the QC process. The one thing I can say AppGeo is really good about and their team is that, yes, we could go out and get 8 land classifications, but the 2 main that we were focusing on was trees and impervious surface. So we spent a lot of time making sure that both of those were the best they could be before we moved into that further final land classification set. And I think that's where your team really came in and allowed us to kind of have a unique ability to come in and create a product that we really wanted for the city.
Well, thanks, Matt. Mike, you've had input into some of these types of assessment programs in the past, these fee-based assessment programs. Is there anything people should think of if they're looking to put something like that together and using tree canopy data to, influence that decision?
Again, one of the great things about a data set that's this high quality, it has so many different applications. And in my experience, jurisdictions adopting a stormwater fee often will come up with either a measurement or a land use class, throw it out to the public, get a lot of political blowback, and then dial it back to what the market will accept. This kind of tool allows you to do scenario modeling to say, what's the funding level we need to actually achieve the clean water outcomes, and then model based on amount of impervious, land use classes, different variables in the data set, and see how they will play out to different publics to make sure that they're fair to everybody and that nobody unjustly has to accept too much of the burden of the cost.
Well, that's great. And I think, some of the takeaways here, LiDAR really gives us some really good data to be able to start from. Couple that with some other different types of data sets, that ortho imagery and some of these planimetrics data sets that cities may have to go along with it, really can help enhance all this data and provide input to all these programs. So, the benefits are far beyond, just the tree canopy itself and sharing that kind of data around and who can use it. So I guess, I'd like to thank our panel today for taking the time to join us. Hopefully, everybody got some good information on how you can make tree canopy, what it does for you, and how it can really provide a lot of benefits to your city. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Aaron.
All right, we had a couple more topics to round out the presentation before we hop into our Q&A. And I want to thank everyone who's been asking questions in the chat throughout the presentation. It's been some lively discussion, so keep that going and feel free to ask some questions for our Q&A session. I did want to bring it back to our panelists and just ask, what throughout this process made working with the AppGeo team different. You can see on the screen here some of my esteemed colleagues through AppGeo, and they're all really unique and wonderful people. But I kind of wanted to hear from our clients directly, like what about AppGeo was a game changer for you, and how did working with AppGeo kind of lead to where we are today, so to speak?
On our end, Aaron, or at least the GIS end, and kind of looking more in the natural resource management, the one thing AppGeo is really good about was catering to our needs. One, as we all know, each city has its own GIS department with its own unique challenges. And you kind of throw in a lot of darts on a board to see what can bite and come back. Their patience and they're willing to kind of take all of the data at once was fantastic. Another thing in that, creating anything and showing us anything that we could use. And I think the tree points are huge. That was not part of our initial RFP. And like Jarlath said, overnight he dropped these points to us and we immediately have put them into real world scenarios. We've created buffering around all of our parks. And now it gives us ability to really manage our parks effectively and efficiently. A really good example, God forbid, if we had attrition, right? The boundaries and the people doing the boundary survey work, all of that knowledge does not leave with them. We have that data. We know where we need to continue to survey. And your team really allowed us to kind of brainstorm together and come up with products that not only we're going to use, but we're going to use into the future extremely well. So I think Crystal can probably piggyback on all sorts of great stuff if she'd like as well.
Yeah, for me, one of the greatest benefits of going with AppGeo started at the very beginning of the proposal, just what they put forward versus what some of the other contractors had, kind of proposed. And what we noticed was that AppGeo, more than anything, they were dedicated to the quality of data that they were putting forward. And they gave us the options between Q1, Q2, and then told us what the kind of the cost benefit analysis of that is. So as an individual that's not well-versed in GIS or LiDAR, they did a great job putting in the proposal exactly what they were going to deliver. And I will say throughout the entire process, every deliverable has been on point, on time, and of the best quality that we could have imagined. So
oh man.
Beyond the good times, just hanging out with Brian and Jarlath on our calls, they're a very animated team that are fun and can take all of our ideas and just kind of like, yeah, let me see if I can do that. Just the quality of the partnership and of the professionalism of this organization, I think really sets them apart from, in my experience, any other company that does this kind of work.
Wow. Well, thank you both for the really kind words. These were not paid actors today. These are the real clients. So you heard it directly from the source. And just as a final theme before we go to our Q&A, I wanted to just really quickly talk about the importance of something that AppGeo holds dear and true is open access to data, developing these data sets, but making them available for others within your city, maybe even your residents to have access to. And, we can help you in those publishing needs, but just some thoughts about, when it comes to these tree data sets, how sharing them and making them widely available across our stakeholders has been a valuable philosophy. Any final thoughts on that before the Q&A? I'll
just say that was one of that was one of my biggest selling points within the bid as well. As I mentioned, my key goal with this is to use the UTC as a communication tool as well as a management tool. So having the ability to have this layman platform that folks can tune into to see exactly where their canopy lies within their neighborhood, and then have them be able to take that conversation to the next level, I think was a great selling aspect of this project.
Excellent. So yeah, we'd love to talk to anyone out there who maybe has data and is looking to make it more available. We have some great tools right off the shelf that can do that. Or you can build something from scratch if need be. So with that, I really want to thank all of our panelists. This has been so much fun. And from here, I want to take it to an open Q&A. We've had a few questions coming through the chat that have been answered. But I wanted to kind of touch on them for those that might not have been reading along. We had some questions. So just so everyone is aware, we use this acronym quite a bit. UTC, that's just Urban Tree Canopy. For a different date, that would be like the data that was collected representing that date, correct? Gotcha. Another quick question that came in here. Here's one from Steve, and this is some critical thinking on his part. I appreciate this one. When looking at the height of the tree for these buffering projects, do you take the height of the tree, or should you add an extra foot or two to account for the roots in the ground when the thing might topple over? Anyone want to take a stab at answering that?
Well, Aaron, I'll say from a mapping perspective, we're mapping the height above the ground because the LiDAR signal does not penetrate the ground. I wish we could see the roots. That would be super cool. So when we do those tree canopy heights, we're just accounting for that from the ground level.
This is Mike. If I could, one of the great things about these tools, say the ISA best management practice for tree risk assessment says you should go from 1 to 1.5 times the height of the tree. Whatever your tree risk policy is, once you have the height, you can buffer that point by the height plus 2 feet, the height plus 1.5 times the height, whatever you want to do. That's one of the great aspects of this tool. It's flexible and you can amend it to your own tree risk program.
Yeah, those are some great insights, Mike. I think that's one of the beautiful things about GIS is you can experiment and, grow your polygons out, see where those collisions are and model under different scenarios, given maybe some extreme weather risks that you have in your city as potential scenarios for what would the outcome be from a damage perspective. Just one other tool in our toolbox for kind of climate forecasting and risk mitigation. I want to continue our Q&A here. We had a couple that were answered through the chat, but I just want to bring them out loud for the benefit of our audience. So this one was to Jarlath. Which software is used for the LiDAR tree classification and tree count? And how can you tell the difference between power lines and a tree when sometimes those power poles are made from a tree, right?
Yeah, and I wish, this is one of those things like I wish we had the Staples easy button, and you'll see a lot of software packages out there and things that do really nice utility line mapping, and you always see, right, it's an example from a transmission line cut through a forest. It's a really clear automated feature extraction technique. I say the most important part of our workflow is having people look at the data. We use a number of different software packages, all which have their strengths and weaknesses to automate it. Utility lines often do have a pattern of sort of a similar height and they're linearly arranged, but in the end, it's an urban environment. It's really, really complicated. And a lot of the techniques that we see published in the literature for transmission line mapping or individual tree mapping really fall apart in an urban area. So it's certainly a semi-automated approach, and we are not just pushing a button and the software doesn't solve all the problems in this case.
Absolutely. And I think you wrote out a list of all the different softwares and packages that you've used. It's quite a long list. So they do know their stuff, and they're taking advantage of some of the most advanced software tools in the industry to get this done. It's real cutting edge stuff. Let's see. I'm just trying to see if there's any other open questions. Here's one that has just come in, hot off the press here. How many spectral bands are there in LiDAR imagery? For example, the project in Cincinnati, and at what resolution is it able to capture at? So we're interested in LiDAR imagery here in Grand Rapids, and we just want to know some more details about the LiDAR as a technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think, I don't know if it's available as a recording, Aaron. We did it's COVID, so I don't remember if we spoke beyond 48 hours, but I know we did a LiDAR webinar at least several months ago with you folks, and folks may want to go to that for more information. So in general, LiDAR actually doesn't have bands like imagery. In most cases, the LiDAR that we're working with, it's a single portion of the electromagnetic spectrum or light near infrared. So when LiDAR is being acquired, you do not see the laser. The key thing we have in LiDAR is the X, Y, and Z locations, so because it's 3D data. And then we do also have the intensity, which is the strength of that near infrared signal returned to the sensor. So LiDAR is absorbed by water. And then there's your question about the resolution. So in Cincinnati, we're really lucky to have what's called QL1 or quality level 1 specification LiDAR. So generally in that case, we're averaging around 8 to 10 points per square meter, which enables us to do sub-meter resolution mapping. So incredibly detailed data. In many cases, for communities now, the USGS standard is QL2, just slightly lower resolution, but still perfectly acceptable for tree canopy mapping.
Yeah, great insights, Jarlath. And just so you all know, we do have that webinar available from our Spatial IQ webinar series, where Jarlath was an esteemed guest previously, and he goes into some really fascinating additional uses for LiDAR within your community, different ways it's been collected. And I will encourage anyone who is really curious about LiDAR technology to watch that, because you'll walk out feeling like an expert yourself.
And for you folks in Grand Rapids, I just did a quick query. You do have LiDAR for your area from about 2016, 2017. So you've got a nice data set there for doing some tree canopy mapping.
Very cool. I guess Alan has asked about some legacy Geiger LiDAR data.
Ooh, Alan,
yeah,
we're really geeking out on LiDAR now. So Geiger mode uses actually different wavelengths, and they can fly the plane higher, and you get even higher point density. And yes, so Alan, we have used Geiger LiDAR. I won't bore the rest of you with the difference between Geiger and discrete return LiDAR. The LiDAR we used for Cincinnati was discrete return, but yes, we've used that for tree canopy assessments. It has some challenges, but a tremendous amount of value, and we're seeing a lot of success with that. So happy to chat with you a bit more if you'd like to reach out with me.
All right, and we are just about now reaching the end of our hour. I want to thank all of our panelists who came together today to deliver this fantastic presentation. I hope it was eye-opening for all of you out there in the audience. We thank you for sticking with us through here to the end. Again, we will distribute a copy of this recording to everyone who registered, so you can go back and rewatch your favorite parts. But in all seriousness, we hope that you join us again in the future, and we're excited for looking forward in this project in Cincinnati and see kind of where things goes. So we appreciate you and hope to have you back at our next webinar. Any final closing remarks from the team?
I'd just like to say that, from the beginning, this process, it's a really smoothly gone process. Working with the city of Cincinnati, we've learned a lot of good stuff with what they're doing, and we've tried to really provide some good data set to them that they're going to be able to use well into the future. But beyond that, share with them how this data can also be used by other stakeholders as well, far beyond the tree canopy crew.
Excellent. Well, with that, I'm going to let everybody go for the afternoon, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.